The North Atlantic does not negotiate. It is a place of absolute freezing indifference. Here, the water is as hard as concrete, and the wind carries the razor-edged chill of the Arctic ice shelf. It does not care about the fragile machinery of men, nor the empires they claim to serve. On the morning of the 8th of April, 1940, the Norwegian Sea was convulsing. A violent northwesterly gale was tearing the tops off the waves, creating a chaotic topography of grey valleys and white-capped peaks. In the centre of this maelstrom, a solitary ship was dying. She was His Majesty's ship Glowworm, G-class destroyer, a greyhound of the ocean, designed for speed, for hunting submarines, for screening the fleet. She carried 149 souls. They were mostly young reservists, boys from Liverpool, London and Portsmouth who had left shop counters and factories to serve. They were trained to drop depth charges, not to stand toe-to-toe with a giant. And yet, there she was. Her bridge was smashed into a tangle of twisted iron. Her hull was perforated, bleeding oil and black smoke into the gale. She was ablaze from stem to stern, rolling heavily in the swell, her decks awash with freezing water and fire. A heavy shell had severed her mast, dropping it across the siren wires. For the last 20 minutes of her existence, the Glowworm did not fight in silence. She fought under the ear-splitting continuous wail of her own jammed siren, a mechanical banshee scream rising above the roar of the cannons and the howling wind. She was burning. She was sinking. She was utterly alone. And she was charging. Facing her was a Leviathan, the German heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, a floating fortress of hardened Krupp armour, displacing 14,000 tons to the Glowworm's 1,300. By every metric of naval warfare, by every rational calculation of survival, the Glowworm was dead. She should have turned away. She should have struck her colours. But the Glowworm did not turn. With her captain dead on his feet, bleeding from multiple wounds, she throttled up. She turned her shattered bow directly toward the towering steel wall of the enemy. This is not a story of victory in the traditional sense. It is a story of the refusal to yield. To understand the end, we must look back 2 days, to a decision that defines the terrible burden of command. It was the spring of 1940. The phony war was ending. The chessboard of Europe was being reset. The British Admiralty, desperate to cut off the flow of Swedish iron ore to the Nazi war machine, had launched Operation Wilfred, a mission to mine Norwegian waters. HMS Glowworm was part of the screen, a protective detail for the massive battlecruiser HMS Renown. The weather on the night of April 6th was atrocious. The fleet was battered by a Force 8 gale. Destroyers are lively ships. In heavy weather they corkscrew violently. In the pre-dawn darkness, a rogue wave, a wall of water appearing out of the blackness, swept the deck of the Glowworm. In an instant a man was washed overboard. In the strict cold calculus of fleet operations, the fleet must not stop. To stop is to lose formation. To stop is to become a stationary target for U-boats prowling the deep. The standard order is to steam on. But the captain of the Glowworm was Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roope. Roope was 35. He had a wife and a young son waiting for him in England. He was not a firebrand or a glory hunter. His crew knew him as a destroyer man of the old school, quiet, pipe-smoking, possessing a steady fatherly competence. He was the sort of officer who calmed the stomach-churning anxiety of his young sailors simply by standing on the bridge. He knew the risks, but he could not leave a man behind in that freezing black water without trying. He signalled the flagship. He requested permission to detach, to turn back into the teeth of the storm and search. Permission was granted. For hours the Glowworm circled in the heaving seas. Every eye on the bridge strained against the greyness, looking for a bobbing head. But the Atlantic is too big, and a human life is too small. Heavy-hearted, Roope was eventually forced to call off the rescue and turn about to rejoin the Renown. But that act of compassion had a fatal cost. While the Glowworm had been searching for one lost soul, the British fleet had moved far ahead. A gap of 60 miles had opened up. Into that gap, the German Navy had slipped. This was not a random patrol. It was the spearhead of Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Norway. The Glowworm was now steaming north, blind, alone, her gyro compass shattered by the storm, sailing directly into the jaw of the trap. Dawn broke on the 8th of April with a thick, hanging fog that clung to the water. Shortly before 8 a.m, the lookouts on the Glowworm stiffened, shapes on the horizon, dark silhouettes cutting through the mist. Roope identified them immediately. 2 German destroyers, the Bernd von Arnim and the Hans Ludemann. The odds were already 2-1. But Roope was aggressive. He engaged immediately. The Glowworm opened fire, her forward guns cracking in the morning air. But the German ships acted strangely. They were heavily armed, yet they did not close to fight. They turned tail and fled into the mist. It looked like a retreat. It was, in fact, a lure. These German destroyers were not hunting. They were carrying troops. Their decks were packed with mountain infantry destined for the seizure of Trondheim. They were heavy, sluggish, and terrified of a lucky British shell hitting their crowded decks. So they ran, signalling frantically to their heavy escort lurking just over the horizon. The trap was sprung, but the real nightmare was still hidden in the fog. Then the mist tore open. Emerging from a squall line to the north was the Admiral Hipper. The difference in scale was grotesque. The Glowworm displaced 1,350 tons. The Hipper displaced 14,000. On the bridge of the Glowworm, men were struggling to stand against the violent pitching of the ship, peering through salt-sprayed binoculars. By contrast, the bridge of the Admiral Hipper was a place of calm, clinical efficiency. The German officers were dry, they were stable, and they possessed a technological terror the British lacked: radar-controlled gunnery. Deep inside the German cruiser, in a warm plotting room, gunnery officers weren't guessing. They were watching a blip on a screen, calculating the range with mathematical precision. Roope knew his ship was doomed, but he also knew the Admiralty did not know this German force was at sea. He had to report the enemy position. He had to buy time for the fleet. He turned to his helmsman. His voice was level. "Steer course 090. We engage." The engagement was short, brutal, and one-sided. Roope turned his small ship broadside to the giant. "Open fire." The Glowworm shuddered as her guns spoke. But moments later the Hipper replied. The first German salvo landed short, throwing up columns of water that drenched the Glowworm's bridge. The second salvo did not miss. An 8-inch shell slammed into the Glowworm. It didn't just damage the ship, it gutted it. The medical station was obliterated. The radio room was turned into a smoking ruin of sparks and twisted metal, though the operators managed to tap out one final partial warning before their equipment disintegrated. Then, the bridge was hit. Roope was knocked off his feet, shrapnel tearing into his thigh. He dragged himself up, gripping the binnacle for support, his white uniform stained dark. "Close the range," he ordered. The distance dropped. 8,000 yards, 6,000 yards. A shell toppled the mast, crushing the galley and shorting the siren wires. The scream began. On the Hipper, Captain Hellmuth Heye watched the burning destroyer with a mixture of annoyance and confusion. This should have been over in minutes. He had the superior firepower. He had the range. But this little British ship refused to die. "Why is he not sinking?" Heye reportedly muttered to his executive officer. "Why is he still firing?" He kept his bow pointed at the Glowworm, presenting a narrow target, while his massive forward turrets picked the destroyer apart piece by piece. The Glowworm was listing heavily to starboard. She was slowing down. Her guns were falling silent. Roope checked the bearing. The Hipper was turning slightly, trying to bring her full broadside to bear for the kill shot. Roope had one card left, a gambler's throw. "Make smoke!" Thick, oily black smoke belched from the glowworm's funnels. Roope steered his ship into the cloud, wrapping herself in a shroud of artificial darkness. On the bridge of the Admiral Hipper, Captain Heye hesitated. The Englishman was finally fleeing. It was the sensible thing to do. Heye ordered his helm to follow the destroyer into the smoke, trusting his radar to find the target in the gloom. He would hunt the rat in its hole and finish it. But inside that blinding cloud, where the air was unbreathable and visibility was zero, Roope was not retreating. He was doing the arithmetic of survival. He watched the magnetic compass swinging. He calculated the enemy's speed. He waited, sweat mixing with the blood on his face. Harder starboard. The glowworm heeled over violently. Her propellers churned the dark water. She wasn't running away. She was turning back. She was becoming a missile. Suddenly, the glowworm burst out of her own smokescreen. The range was point blank, less than 400 yards. On the German bridge, the atmosphere of clinical detachment evaporated instantly. Lookouts screamed warnings. Officers scrambled for handrails. The massive grey shape of the destroyer was rushing at them, growing larger by the second, filling the entire view of the bridge windows. "Harder port! Full astern!" Heye screamed. The massive Hipper tried to turn. Her engines roared in reverse, the water boiling at her stern as she tried to arrest her momentum. But physics is a cruel mistress. A 14,000-ton cruiser carries immense inertia. She could not stop. She drifted sluggishly, exposing her vulnerable starboard side. Roope held his course. There was no gunfire now, just the roar of the engines and the scream of the siren. "Stand by for collision." The glowworm slammed into the Hipper. The destroyer's bow crumpled like foil. But the sheer kinetic force of the impact drove her into the cruiser's side, just aft of the anchor. The glowworm tore a 100-foot gash in the German armoured belt. She ripped open the torpedo tubes. She punched a hole into the storage compartments, flooding the German ship with 500 tons of freezing water. For a moment the two ships were locked together, the tiny, broken destroyer pinned against the flank of the giant in a deadly embrace. Then the glowworm fell away. She drifted down the side of the Hipper, her bow missing, her fires raging. And in a final act of defiance, Petty Officer Walter Townley, manning the single remaining operational gun, swung his barrel around. He fired. The shell struck home at point-blank range, burying itself in the German superstructure. The end came quickly. The glowworm capsized to starboard. Her boilers exploded as the cold sea hit the superheated metal. She slid beneath the waves. The siren finally stopped. On the Hipper, Captain Heye looked down at the oil-stained water. He was a Prussian officer of the old school, stern, rigid, but bound by a code of honour. He was visibly shaken. He knew he had just witnessed an act of bravery that transcended the uniform. He made a decision that terrified his own crew. He ordered his ship to stop. This was madness. They were in enemy waters. The sea was likely swarming with British submarines. To stop a heavy cruiser dead in the water was to paint a target on their own backs. His officers scanned the waves anxiously for periscopes, but Heye refused to leave. For over an hour, the German crew threw ropes and cargo nets over the side. They hauled 38 freezing, oil-soaked survivors onto their deck. They found Lieutenant Commander Roope in the water. He was exhausted. He had spent his last reserves of strength helping his young reservists find life jackets, pushing them toward the ropes, shouting encouragement. When the rope finally came for him, he reached out, but the cold had done its work. His frozen, oil-slicked fingers could not hold the purchase. He slipped away. A wave washed over him, and he vanished into the deep. The Hipper limped into Trondheim. But the glowworm had extracted her pound of flesh. The damage was severe. The torn hull and flooded compartments forced the Hipper back to Germany for dry dock repairs, taking her out of the war for weeks. Roope had not only fought, he had removed a capital ship from the board at a critical moment in history. But the story does not end there. Weeks later, a letter arrived at the British Admiralty in London. It had travelled via the International Red Cross, crossing the battle lines of a world at war. It was written by Captain Hellmuth Heye. In the letter, Heye eulogized his enemy. He wrote of a man who fought a superior force with lion-hearted courage, a man who engaged to save his fleet and who fought his ship until the very planks beneath his feet were gone. Heye concluded with a formal request. He recommended that the British government award Lieutenant Commander Gerard Roope a decoration for valour. It was a request without precedent, but the evidence was undeniable. Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roope was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest award for valour in the British Empire. He was the first VC recipient of the Second World War, and the only one in history to be awarded on the recommendation of the enemy who killed him. The Glowworm lies at the bottom of the Norwegian Sea today. The steel has rusted away. The names of her crew are etched on stone memorials in quiet towns across England. But the legacy of that morning remains. It is a reminder that even in the industrial slaughter of total war, there remains a capacity for honour. That courage can be recognised across the sights of a gun, and it poses a question to us all. When the gyro is broken, when the fog is thick, and when the enemy is a giant, do we run, or do we turn into the smoke? Commander Roope and his crew taught the world that victory isn't always about who sails away. Sometimes victory is simply the refusal to yield.